The Coachella Valley Firebirds have a 2-0 lead over the Milwaukee Admirals. And while this feels great, I can't help but think, are we going to lose a key performer from this year's Calder Cup run? Let's talk about that and more on today's episode of Locked On Kraken.
You are Locked On Kraken, your daily podcast on the Seattle Kraken, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what do you say, Seattle hockey fans? Welcome to another episode of Locked On Kraken, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We bring you your favorite team every single day. If we're meeting for the first time, my name is right on the lower part of the screen. If you're watching on YouTube, Erica L. Ayala here. I've been your host of Locked On Kraken from the very beginning. I currently am with CBS Sports as both a hockey and women's basketball writer and analyst on CBS Sports HQ. On today's episode, we have a lot to get into. We're going to cover our ECHL team and their series, our AHL team and their series. But I want to talk first about one particular player who Seattle Kraken fans know very well. He's been with us since, that's right, our very first big event, I would argue, the expansion draft. So we're going to talk about Chris Driedger. But first, today's episode of Locked On Kraken brought to you by our friends at GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Okay. Big question for our first segment, which does impact the Seattle Kraken, is what are we going to do with Chris Driedger? Now, you've heard me talk about Chris Driedger with Jason JD Hernandez, the PA voice of the Coachella Valley Firebirds. He's also the host of Locked On Anaheim Ducks. You heard me talk about Chris Driedger with Ann Kimmel, who's one of your co-hosts of Locked On Predators. And of course, the Milwaukee Admirals are the Preds affiliate in the AHL. We have a 2-0 series lead over the Admirals now. And the question becomes, what do we do with Chris Driedger? Joey Daccord had a great season for the Seattle Kraken. Philipp Grubauer still kind of battling back from injury, but I think had another good season for the Seattle Kraken. The other thing is, those two guys, they're on contract. Chris Driedger is a free agent. And just the other day, we had one of our everydayers, one of our longtime listeners, Striatic, first compliment, of course, the ever fun and informative Ann Kimmel, but also said, unlike most of the others, it's incredibly unlikely Driedger stays with the organization next year. And by others, he meant some of the other players that we were talking about in that Squadcast episode with Ann Kimmel. But Calder Cup winner has huge implications for a goaltending free agent. Speaking of, if the Coachella Valley Firebirds, of course, can get through the Admirals and win the next series. I am excited to see where he ends up next season and will always be a fan of his no matter where he plays. And last year, if you're an everydayer and an OGer, you know that in addition to our episodes, I was also doing watch parties. And I know we have people, especially our YouTube viewers and listeners, that really like Chris Driedger. I just don't think the timing worked out. And, it's unfortunate in the long term, but right now we're enjoying the work of Chris Driedger. So this year, Chris Driedger helped the Firebirds to a 2-1 win over Milwaukee. We talked about that with Ann. We talked about it a little bit also with JD. And then he helped the Firebirds to a 3-1 victory over the Milwaukee Admirals in Game 2. Now, right now, the Seattle Kraken affiliate, the Coachella Valley Firebirds, have the same lead through 2 games as they had over Milwaukee last year. Last year, though, a little bit of a different story. 6-4 was your score after Game 1. And then 5-3 was your score after game 2. Now, small sample size. And also, we heard Dan Bylsma, our new soon-to-be head coach of the Seattle Kraken, who's now, of course, the active coach of our Firebirds. But he talked about how this is a different series, even though we're playing the same opponent. It's a different team. And I do think, again, we've talked about this with JD. You should check out that episode that we have where we have JD talking, and we're talking about the difference between Chris Driedger and Joey Daccord in net at the Firebirds level, because both are, as Dan Bylsma said, he was speaking specifically about Chris Driedger this year, but both, in my estimation, are NHL goalies. And again, that's something that Dan Bylsma said after game 2, the 3-1 victory over Milwaukee. That's what Dan Bylsma had to say about Chris Driedger. He's been huge in the game against Milwaukee in game 2. He faced 32 shots and only gave up 1 goal. That was, an early goal in the second period to Ozzy Weisblatt. But then it was all Firebirds, or I should say really before then. The Firebirds got a goal by Andrew Podorowski in the first 30 seconds of the game. You love to see that. And, power play, the Coachella Valley Firebirds were 1-4 on the PP. 0-3, though, was Milwaukee on their power play. So, yes, that does have to do with our penalty kill and our special teams overall, but that's also Driedger making a decent amount of shots. He was your first star of the game after game 2. So what does this mean for Chris Driedger? Well, if we look at cap friendly, right now he is among the UFAs going into or in this offseason. So Chris Driedger is there. Stetska is also another free agent as far as goaltenders are concerned. We've talked about Justin Schultz. I mentioned Connor Carrick, actually. I think it was probably with JD, either with JD or Ann, but I think JD and I were talking. But, Connor Carrick is a free agent. We've got let's see, Justin Schultz, who we've talked about before, Andrew Podorowski, Cole Lind, Max McCormick, Cam Hughes, Devin Shore, John Hayden, Pierre-Edouard Belmar, Tomasz Tatar. There's a lot of free agents, and we're kind of talking about Chris Driedger. And I do think that I agree with Striatic. I've said it before. He's probably not with the Seattle Kraken organization next year. I agree with what Dan Bylsma said. He is an NHL level goalie, and we're not going to be able to keep him with the Firebirds. So now you have a situation where the Coachella Valley Firebirds, who very well could make the Calder Cup finals for the second consecutive season, are going to be without their head coach, maybe without their starting netminder, at least for this past season, 23-24, and maybe out 1, possibly even 2 assistants. How does the organization rebuild? We don't really know what that's going to look like, but we have the off season to figure it out. And right now, I say we just ride the wave. We enjoy the time that we get to see the Coachella Valley Firebirds play. If you're not already tapped in, make sure you're watching these AHL games. Make sure you head over to the Firebirds YouTube page, and I'll start migrating them over to Locked On Kraken if I'm able to. But make sure that you're listening to what Disco Dan Bylsma is saying after these games. He's our next head coach. His approach to media is so different. I've spoken to Dan. I know a lot of our Locked On Kraken insiders know that because we've had him on the podcast with exclusive interviews just for you. So I know I've had conversations with Dan. He likes the kind of questions that I ask, which is always lovely. You don't always aim for that. You don't always get that, but it's a good time when the people that you're interviewing think that you ask good questions and they like talking hockey to you. And Dan Bylsma seems that way. He also has a little bit more of a, I'll say friendly banter, bordering on the line of, kind of poking fun at questions that he thinks are maybe a little bit outside of what he would like to answer in any given day. So definitely check it out. I think he's got a great demeanor. He's going to come off as more personable than Dave Haxtell. And there's actually a really interesting article for the Seattle Times that we're going to break down a little bit more, because even though I like Dan, I like the possibility of some of the Firebirds coming with him. As this article quoted, I forget where the quote comes from, but effectively it's going to be talking about you're only as good as your roster. And if you're an everyday or an OGer, you know that even though I understood why we got rid of Dave Haxtell, I love that we're bringing in Dan Bylsma. For me, the problems all start with how we were putting the roster together. And I get the sense, and it rightfully so, that the Seattle Kraken wanted to get this head coaching announcement out of the way, but this still leaves the front office on the hook for a lot of things. And I've kind of been talking about front office moves that are going to need to be made. I don't see the front office, going to get Chris Driedger. Who does he bump out? And just before we wrap up this segment, Joey Daccord is he is on the roster. And under contract. Joey Daccord is under contract. He's not a UFA until next season. And then with Philipp Grubauer, he's not an unrestricted free agent until 2027-28. So yeah, we don't, unless something drastic changes, we don't have room for Chris Driedger. And Chris Driedger's been playing well enough where he deserves to fight for a spot. I guess we'll see. But we'll talk a little bit more about the AHL matchup and, of course, get you ready for another ECHL matchup. The Mavericks, they have a really interesting series going on. And I'm just going to let you know now, if you like goals scored, whether they're for or against, you're probably going to like the next two segments, because whether we're talking retro AHL Western Conference finals between Milwaukee and Coachella Valley, or if we're talking about the ECHL Kelly Cup finals, let's just say there have been lots of goals. That is coming up on this episode of Locked On Kraken. Mentioned it at the top of the show, but today's episode is brought to you by our friends at GameTime. I tell you all the time, I love using the GameTime app. When I'm out of town especially, I always make sure I have that GameTime app fired up and that I check out the shows that are happening in whatever city that I'm in. In Seattle, I've been able to use GameTime to go to the Neptune Theater and watch one of my favorite bands, Little Dragon. I've also used GameTime to get my friend and I tickets to the M's, to the Mariners. I like to sit on the third base side. And so with GameTime, not only will I go in the app, I can see exactly what everything is going to cost with fees, but I can also see the view from my seat. I love the GameTime app. GameTime is just a really great way to find tickets, last minute prices, last minute deals, last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. The GameTime guarantee. If you find a seat for the same event, same row, same section, and you find it for less, you'll get 110% of what you paid GameTime right back to you. So let me tell you how you can get in on the know with GameTime. Make sure you download the GameTime app and create an account, and then you use promo code LOCKEDONNHL. That will get you $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Thanks as always for making Locked On Kraken a part of your daily destination. Erica L. Ayala here, your host of Locked On Kraken. And listen, I'm excited because we do have playoff hockey. It's not NHL playoff hockey. I mean, excuse me. There still is NHL playoff hockey going on. It's just that the Seattle Kraken are not in it. Congratulations to Florida. Congratulations to Edmonton. Well done, Alex Wenberg. You got, one series further than you did with the Seattle Kraken last year with the New York Rangers. Always going to wish our guys that were with us for that inaugural season well. But I want the Kraken. I want the Kraken back in the playoffs. But that's okay because our next head coach is in the playoffs right now, and he's taking on a familiar foe, the Milwaukee Admirals. Now, I said earlier that the Firebirds have a 2-0 lead. They had a 2-0 lead last year, but I mentioned the goaltending. Well, I should say the goals. There were a lot more goals. 10 goals in game 1. Another 8 goals in game 2 last year when these two teams played. So yeah, Joey Daccord and the rest of the Firebirds put up a lot of work, and that kind of followed them throughout all levels of the playoffs. We can talk about that some other time. But then things got a little dicey. When the series moved to Milwaukee, as it will now, the Firebirds, that is, dropped the next 2 games. Milwaukee won game 3, 3-1. Milwaukee won game 2, 5-2. And then the Firebirds were able to take game 4, game 5, 2-1. And then got the win on home ice, 4-3. So it was a tight series. It went back and forth. And Dan Bilesman talked about that. And I mentioned in the first segment that he talked about these teams are a little bit different now. They're structured a little bit differently. That being said, that he and his players who played last season, his coaching staff, they remember this. Those numbers that I was just telling you, they remember what that felt like. They know that it's hard to transition, especially away from the amazing Firebirds fans. They all they were asked, but they also did talk about how something JD mentioned. There was a recent American Idol contestant that just sang the national anthem, and that hyped them up. It hyped up the crowd. They talked about how the crowd was great, Bilesma in particular. And so they're going to be away from that. So you got to get business done on the road. You got to do it early. And so seeing that the Firebirds got that early goal, the first 28 seconds, if I want to be technical about it, but within the first 30, I mean, that was perfect. It was great. It was great to see them attack early. It's great to see that, Podorowski got that goal, a little bit of by being a net front presence. Riker Evans had a beautiful, chef's kiss goal in that game as well. Dan Bilesma talked a lot about Riker. He was asked about Riker as well. And I'm just so excited because Dan knows the growing pains of some of the guys that he's going to get to coach at the Seattle Kraken, which is intriguing if we do keep Driedger. I'm kind of with Striatic. I don't see a world in where we keep Driedger, where we retain him, where we renew a contract with him, unless we have some big intel or we plan to move Gruby or Daccord. I just don't see that happening. Now, I wouldn't be against it, just how everything's went down. I don't think you step away from Joey. And Philipp has had a tough go with Seattle. He really has. We talk about it all the time, but a lot of people put a lot of crap on on Grubauer that I don't think is fair. On all of our goaltenders, that's not fair. Anyway, I digress. That's a whole nother story. But the opportunity to see Shane Wright, Riker Evans, Joey Daccord even, right? I'm curious who else can kind of make the cut there and in the next year or two really have a strong presence with the Kraken, who've been with Dan Bilesma and the Firebirds. Ty Cartier, I think he got a little lost in the sauce towards the end of last season for the Seattle Kraken. So to see Dan and perhaps one, maybe two of his assistants come and revitalize some of that young blood, I'm really excited. I'm also really excited, and this kind of goes into some things that we'll talk about in the next handful of episodes this week and next week, but I'm excited for what this means now that the Kraken have the number 8 pick. because you can get a pretty solid prospect. Actually, we're getting ready for our mock draft. So my pick is in. We're gonna unleash that release, if you will, that mock draft soon. So I'll keep you updated. That's the whole Locked On NHL channel is doing that. But my pick is in. I did not do great last year. We've talked about it. But I like this pick and I like this draft because, well, wouldn't you know, there are a lot of pretty solid defenders that are expected to go pretty high in the draft. So yeah, this draft definitely piqued my interest. Anyway, I think there's a lot of talent on this AHL roster that we can really see do some amazing things. And I'm excited to see, how it all plays out. I mentioned, and I talked about Shane Wright a little bit. We did not see Shane Wright. I just want to double check. Yeah, we did not see Shane Wright in game 2. He has been out with injury for a little bit. So I haven't heard the latest. I don't recall him being asked, that being Dan Bylsma. I don't think he was asked after the last game about, Shane Wright, but it'll be curious to see. It's unfortunate that he's not healthy right now and that he's missing some time. But the Firebirds are doing really well. And I mentioned before, he is expected to come back for this series. So it'll be curious to see how that goes down. Before we close out today's episode, I got to get you ready for another series. We have our ECHL series, and this is the final series of the ECHL. That's right. For the first time in their history, the Kansas City Mavericks have made it to the Calder Cup finals. And game 1 maybe didn't go their way, but game 2 was a different story. Remember, I told you, if you like goals, then you should be paying attention to our affiliates because, goals on goals on goals. And we're going to talk about that coming up on today's episode of Locked On Kraken. Thanks as always for making Locked On Kraken a part of your daily destination. The Seattle Kraken, of course, in their pipeline of affiliates. We just talked about the AHL team, the Coachella Valley Firebirds, and we're going to talk about the ECHL team next. That's our Kansas City Mavericks. And I know some people might say, hey, and I know Ann mentioned this also when we did our Squadcast. Hey, why are we talking about the Mavericks versus the Everblades? Why are we talking about the Admirals versus the Firebirds? These are the guys we're going to see if our scouts and our development team does what they should be doing. These are the guys that we're going to see with the Kraken. And my estimation, especially with Dan Bylsma taking over as head coach, is that we're going to see some young blood sooner rather than later. And I tell you what, I'm here for the youth movement. And that could mean opening up some things with the salary cap if the Seattle Kraken really go into, some people want to call it rebuild, retool, whatever the case is. We've got some older, more seasoned players that are eating up a decent amount of cap space. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see, and we're going to start crunching those numbers, but I want to get through this series, this ECHL championship series for the Mavericks, this series with the Admirals, the conference championship with the Firebirds, and then I think we can start putting pieces together, but especially when those teams are out of contention. But that's not something that we have to worry about now. We've got 2 teams still racing, duking it out in the playoffs. And let me tell you, that first game wasn't great. Wasn't great for the Mavericks. They gave up 8 goals total. Goals on goals on goals. 3 in the first, 4 in the second stanza, as I like to say, and just 1 goal in the third. So, I mean, they cleaned it up a little, but just a tough night at the office for Morris, for Cale Morris. We actually have some audio from Jack LaFontaine that we're going to play for you, especially for our insiders. But, it was tough. LaFontaine comes in a little bit later. He played almost 20 minutes. 10 shots faced, makes 9 saves. So there you go. I mean, I know, and if you listen to the show, if you're an everydayer, if you're an OGer, but especially if you're an insider, then you know that Tad O'Had, who's the general manager and head coach for the Kansas City Mavericks, has liked that he can go to both of his goalies at any given time. This was a tough night at the office. Florida scores in the first 3 minutes. We technically don't, it's not considered a response goal. And actually, Tad O'Had has his own method and formula for that, which again, I'll have that audio for you. But we score within the next, 3.5 minutes in that first period. But then it's just 2 unanswered to close the first. 4 goals in the second. And by that point, there was just no offense churning for the Mavericks in the second frame. You can also see that Kansas City did not capitalize on their power play. Another choppy game, 7 penalties overall, but 5 for Kansas City, and they converted on none. Now, they also held Florida scoreless on the power play, but those are things that you got to take advantage of. And the Mavericks just weren't able to do it in game 1. So game 1, you kind of want to forget it. But game 2, 6 goals, 5 of them for the Kansas City Mavericks. So it's almost like, they took exception to not playing well and maybe some of the other things that were happening. Tight game early on. Both teams score in the first frame. Kansas City Mavericks keeps Florida off the board in the middle frame, the second stanza and the third stanza, but gets 2 goals of their own in each of those periods and in those 20-minute goes. So once again, Florida strikes first, but Jeremy McKenna, again, a name you need to know. Jeremy McKenna has been amazing, has been fantastic for the Kansas City Mavericks. He gets the first goal of the game in game 2. And then you see Max Andreev, who we've had on the show, Jacob Hayhurst, assisted, primary assist by McKenna. And then Cole Koski, Hayhurst got that assist. And finally, Andreev, he scores again. And that's all she wrote. So a better outing here for the Kansas City Mavericks. And that's one thing, I've said it before, I'll say it again. I like the resilience of the Kansas City Mavericks. Tad O'Had and his staff, they never let the Mavericks get too high or too low, at least in one game, and particularly one series against a singular opponent. They have this team poised. And I think it goes back to some of the things. There are, I believe it's 5 principles that the Kansas City Mavericks really focus on. And again, you'll hear the audio from Tad as we get ready for their next game, because I just think he really has this team focus. And even if things aren't going the way they want, the fact that they can bounce back is huge. Jack LaFontaine played this whole game, 36 shots faced, 35 saves. His counterpart faced 19 shots. So you're still seeing the Kansas City Mavericks are getting outshot. It's something that I'm noticing. I'm not necessarily concerned about it. But again, I spoke to Jack LaFontaine about some of that, and I think you'll be interested to hear what he had to say. So something that we're going to keep an eye on, there were 2 empty netters, so that's also worth noting in this one. Much different scenario. And you know what else was different? This wasn't different. We had 5 or more power play opportunities. So another choppy game as far as the physicality and just some of the little ticky-tack stuff. But what was different is that the Firebirds were 3 of 6. So 50% on the power play while still being perfect on the penalty kill. All right. So this is a team that they're definitely young, and it's the growing pains. It's the ECHL. And that's where some of the start and stop or some of the rougher, the games with rougher edges, that's where that comes from. But the discipline, I'm so excited to see if any of these guys end up as mainstays with the Firebirds and if they then can make their way up. Not everyone's going to do that. That's not everyone's path, especially when we have an entry draft coming up. So you're going to get guys that are coming from college or other junior leagues that are going to be vying for position. But I've told you this before. I'll say it again. I like Jack LaFontaine. I think he's showing in this series, which is for the trophy, that he's probably the number one. Now, Morris will have to bounce back, especially because, this is a series where we're traveling from not really all the way from the West Coast to the East Coast, but you're changing, you're rolling through a few states here. So rest and recovery is something that's super important to Tad O'Had and his staff. So I'll be curious to see how things pan out. But if I were a betting woman, I would say that tomorrow, June 5th, we see Jack LaFontaine. The series is at Florida, so they are on the road now. They've got 3 games in Florida. They could close out the series. It's tied, though, 1-1. So it's not like anyone has a stronghold, but you're going into someone else's barn, and you want to get some momentum, if anything, to make sure you get at least one more game back at home with the potential to win it all in front of your fans. All right, folks. So we've got a game Wednesday, June 5th in Florida. So that's Eastern time, 7:30 Eastern. So that's 4:30 Pacific time. That's going to be our very own, our very own Kansas City Mavericks taking on the Florida Everblades. And then when it comes to your Western Conference Finals, the next game is tonight. I failed to mention that, I think, in our second stanza, if you will, our second segment. But we have a game tonight. It's a game day. It's a Firebirds game day. Get fired up. That's right. Chris Driedger is likely going to lead the team against Milwaukee. They're in Milwaukee, and that's a 7 p.m. game. So lots more playoff hockey to talk about, and we're effectively talking about prospects. And although we have one main, prospect that we haven't talked about on this episode, but we will talk about, his team didn't quite make it to the final, but he's bringing home some hardware anyway. That is the one and only Jaeger Furcus. And we're going to talk about the Furcus Circus and some other prospects. As we get a sense, I don't think the Kraken are really showing their cards on what they want to do in the offseason. So that means I get to tell you what I would do if I were the GM of the Seattle Kraken. And for what it's worth, what I would do versus what I think the Kraken would do, not always the same. Not always the same. Oftentimes it's not, which I honestly think is probably as much a good idea as it is a bad. I feel like we're about 50-50. I do hope the Kraken listen to me a little bit more on defense, which again goes to who I picked for the Seattle Kraken as if I were the GM in our Locked On NHL mock draft. My pick is in. We're getting everything ready for you, and I will let you know when that is ready to go live. But that's our show, folks. As I always close out, be kind to yourself, be kind to one another, hold fast, stay true. Let's go Kraken. Let's go Firebirds. And of course, let's go Mavericks. I will catch you on the next episode. Peace out, everybody.